How's everybody doing? I've got here Chapter 6 of Book 3 of the Royal Ranger series, Duel at Araluen. Let's go ahead and get into it. Maddie unrolled the map she had drawn before she left Castle Araluen. She had copied it from the large wall map in Cassandra's command center on the 9th floor. She spread it out on the wide bowl of a tree stump as Hal, Thorn, and Stig gathered round, leaning to look over her shoulder as she touched the map with the point of her sax. This is the Wesel River. It's north of here, as you can see, maybe 12 kilometers from where we are at the moment. And here, 6 or 7 kilometers east of Harnell village, is an old hill fort, built hundreds of years ago, but deserted and derelict in recent times. This is where my father and Gillen are trapped. Trapped? Thorn asked. Trapped by who? Hal grinned. Shouldn't that be, by whom? Thorn glared at him. She knows what I mean. He turned his gaze back to Maddie. Trapped by who? He repeated. Then, to make himself totally clear, he added, whom has trapped them? A mixed force of the Red Fox clan and Sunderland mercenaries, Maddie said. Stig snorted derisively. Sonderlanders. They'd fight their own grandmothers for money. Thorn nodded agreement, then added, mind you, their grandmothers would probably give them a shellacking. But Hal held up a hand for silence. Just a moment. Who are these Red Fox people? Maddie hesitated. In her enthusiasm, she had jumped right in, she realized. She had a habit of doing that, assuming that her listeners knew what she was talking about before she actually told them. Maybe I'd better start at the beginning. Hal nodded. That would be good. She gathered her thoughts and launched into a brief explanation of the plot hatched by the Red Fox clan to lure Horace and Gillen away with most of the garrison and to usurp the throne, and of Damon's leading role in it. As she mentioned his name, Hal raised his eyebrows. Damon? Wasn't he left in command of the garrison? He had us all fooled, Maddie said bitterly. Mum and Dad thought he was loyal. They trusted him implicitly. I didn't like him, Thorn growled. She turned a steady gaze on the old sea-wolf. I planned to kill him, she said quietly. Thorn nodded his approval. I'll try not to get in your way. Stig was rubbing his jaw as he thought over what Maddie had told them. But what does he hope to gain by this treachery? The throne, Maddie said. He's actually a distant relative of my mother. If he can remove my grandfather, my mother, my father, and me, he'll have a legitimate claim to the throne. His plan is to blame the revolt on the Red Fox clan. Naturally, he'll deny any connection to them. In fact, he'll say that he drove them off, but too late to save my mother, and there'll be nobody left alive to argue the toss. Then he'll make his claim for the throne, all the while looking sad and sorrowful about the whole situation. She studied their faces as they let this sink in. Then she added, unfortunately, there are a lot of people in Araluen who would welcome a return to the law of male succession. I always thought your mother was a popular figure, Stig said. Maddie nodded. She is, but that's mainly an Araluen fief and some of the surrounding fiefdoms, like Redmont. Farther north and west, they know little about her. And remember, she's not actually the queen yet, so he wouldn't be seen to be replacing her. Hal was studying the map. He tapped the symbol representing the hill fort. So what's Gillen doing getting himself trapped? He asked. The Herons had worked with Gillen in the past, and they tended to think of him as the person in charge. He and my father were tricked. They had reports that there was a small band of Red Fox rebels causing a disturbance up here. No more than 30 or 40, they thought. They took 40 cavalrymen and archers with them to nip any possible trouble in the bud. Except when they got there, they found they were facing over 150 troops. Nasty surprise, Hal said. Do they know what's about to happen at Castle Araluen? We don't think so, Maddie said. There's no way they could have heard about it. If they had, I think my father would have done something rash, like trying to break out of the fort in a direct frontal assault. Not a good idea, Hal said. He was studying the map again, as if he could see the opposing forces at the old hill fort. No, they're relatively safe in the fort, but if they try to break out, the Red Foxes will see them coming and be ready for them. There will be no element of surprise, and they'll be outnumbered by 3 to 1. Maybe the Red Foxes plan to starve them out. How much food do they have? Stig asked. Maddie inclined her head, uncertainly. Not a lot. They took rations for maybe 14 days, so they must be running short by now. They could always eat their horses, Thorn put in. Maddie raised an eyebrow at him. They'll never do that. Try telling a cavalryman to eat his horse. That'd be like telling you to eat your ship, she said. She hesitated as she realized how ludicrous that sounded. Hal grinned. It's not quite the same thing, he said, but I see your point. Stig here could probably eat a ship if he was hungry enough, Thorn said, straight-faced. Stig looked sidelong at him. He was used to the old sea-wolf's teasing. I'd need a lot of salt, he said. Seeing that Thorn was about to reply, Hal cut short their banter. The question is, he said, what do you want from us? Maddie hesitated. This was the crucial point. Her mother had been confident that the Herons would throw in their lot with Horace and Gillen's men. But Cassandra had known them for years. If she were to ask for their help personally, they would almost certainly give it. But Maddie had only met them once before, and she wasn't so sure. As things stand, she said slowly, there's no way for my dad and Gillen to break out of the fort without the enemy seeing them coming and being ready for them. They might win the ensuing battle. My dad is a very capable warrior. Gillen's no slouch either, Hal said, and his companions grunted their agreement. But even if they did win, they'd lose a lot of men in a straightforward pitched battle like that. They'd be outnumbered, and they'd have no advantages on their side. On the other hand, she paused, looking meaningfully at the 3 Scandians. If we could launch a surprise attack from the rear, just as Dad and Gillen attacked down the hill, that might tip the battle in our favor. She paused to see their reactions, and her spirits rose as she saw them nodding. I know there are only a dozen in your crew, but Mum said 1 Scandian is the equivalent of 3 normal warriors. Hal smiled lazily at her. Why, Ranger Maddie, he said, are you trying to influence us with exaggerated compliments? She flushed, feeling her cheeks redden. No, She stopped, searching for words, and he touched her arm, letting her off the hook. It's all right, he said. Your mother is right. 1 Scandian is the equivalent of 3 ordinary warriors. 4, if the Scandian is me, Thorn averred. She smiled at him gratefully. I can believe that. And there's something else, Hal added. There's not a dozen of us. There are over 30 of us, if we count Wolfbiter's crew. Would they join us? Maddie asked. She knew her mother and Gillen were old friends of the Heron's crew, but Jern and his men were a different matter. Hal shrugged. I don't see why not, he said. After all, as the duty ship, they swore an oath of loyalty to the legitimate rulers of Araluen. And I've never known a wolfship crew who would refuse the opportunity for a good fight, Stig said. And I've never known a wolfship crew who'd pass up the opportunity to wallop a few Sonderlanders, Thorn added. Let's ask them, Hal said. He rose from his crouched position by the tree stump and started toward the 2 ships' crews, who were waiting expectantly, relaxing on the grass nearby. Listen up, lads, he said, raising his voice. Maddie here has asked a favor of us. Her father and the Ranger Gillen are surrounded in a hill fort to the north of here by a ragtag group of Sonderland mercenaries and some locals. There was a growl of subdued anger from the Scandians. As Thorn had intimated, Sonderlanders were not their favorite people. How many Sonderlanders? Asked one of Jern's crew. About 150, and there are 40 Araluens inside the fort. Maddie has asked us if we'll help them. The plan is for us to launch a surprise attack on the rear of the mercenaries, while the Araluen troops attack downhill. I've already said my crew will help. He looked at Jern, and I'm assuming the Wolfbiter crew will join us. Jern chewed his lip thoughtfully before replying. You're asking us to commit ourselves to a battle on the word of a mere girl? She's hardly more than a child. Some Scandians, regrettably, were conservative in their attitudes as to a woman's place in the world. Hal's eyes narrowed. This child, he said, is a ranger, a fourth-year apprentice. The Herons nodded their heads approvingly. They had dealt with rangers before. The Wolfbiter crew were more doubtful. They had been the duty ship in Araluen for some months, but in that time they'd had little to do with the ranger corps. So she's an apprentice, Blorst Knucklewhite said. He was one of the rowing crew on the Wolfbiter. That means she isn't fully qualified, doesn't it? Long on muscle, short on brain, like all rowers, Hal thought. He could see that a demonstration of Maddie's abilities might be called for. He turned to the young ranger. See that alder tree yonder? He asked. Maddie looked in the direction he indicated. The tree was a good 100 meters away. There's a black mark on the bark, Hal continued. Could you put 2 arrows into it for us? Before he had finished the sentence, Maddie had unslung her bow, nocked an arrow, and let fly without seeming to aim. A second arrow hissed away while the first was still in the air. Both of them slammed into the mark Hal had designated. The crew of Wolfbiter looked suitably surprised and impressed. The Herons smiled with an I could have told you expression. But before anyone could speak, Maddie had dropped the bow and whipped her sling from under her belt, fitting a shot into the pouch in one deft movement. She pointed to the Heron, nosed up on the bank 40 meters away. The shields of the 2 crews lined the sides of the ship. The shield with the red X, she said, on the right-hand edge. Then she stepped forward and whipped the sling up and over her head. The shot flashed away, and seconds later struck the shield with a resounding crack. As she had forecast, it struck on the right-hand edge of the shield, setting it rocking back and forth. By sheer chance, the shield happened to belong to Blorst Knucklewhite. Orlog's ears, he said. This girl is downright dangerous. His shipmates muttered their agreement, while the Herons laughed at the startled expressions on their faces. Hal knew that Scandians valued skill at arms highly, and Maddie had just demonstrated her ability, and her worth. He turned back to Jern. This mere girl, as you call her, is the daughter of Princess Cassandra and Sir Horace, and she's apprenticed to the Ranger Will Treaty. If you know your recent history, you might recall all 3 of them had a lot to do with the defeat of the Eastern Riders when they tried to invade our country some years back. I think we owe them, don't you? There was a murmur of agreement from the Wolfbiter crew. Jern held his hands out in surrender. We'll fight for her, he said. I just wanted to make sure you knew what you were doing. All right, that's going to conclude Chapter 6. I want to thank you all for listening, and I will see you next time in Chapter 7. God bless, and have a good one.